Waiting used to be woven into daily life in a way that felt natural, almost invisible. It wasn't something we complained about or tried to avoid. It was simply how things worked. You waited because there was no other option, and because of that, waiting never felt like a punishment. It felt like part of the rhythm of living. Back then, nothing arrived instantly. Answers took time. Entertainment had schedules. Communication required patience. If you wanted something, you often had to sit with the wanting for a while. That space between desire and fulfillment wasn't empty. It was filled with anticipation, imagination, and the quiet understanding that time moved at its own pace. We waited for phone calls without knowing who would be on the other end. We waited for our favorite shows to come on at a specific hour. We waited for letters to arrive in the mail, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Waiting wasn't framed as inefficiency. It was simply the cost of connection. There was a kind of trust built into that waiting. Trust that the call would eventually come, that the show would eventually air, that the letter would eventually arrive. We didn't refresh screens or demand updates. We accepted uncertainty as part of the process. And in doing so, we learned how to live inside it. Waiting shaped our days in quiet ways. It slowed us down without asking permission. It created pauses where nothing was required of us. In those pauses, life filled the space naturally. We talked to whoever was nearby. We stared out windows. We let our minds wander without feeling the need to occupy every second. At the time, none of this felt meaningful. It felt ordinary, even inconvenient. We believed that faster would always be better, that less waiting would mean more living. We didn't realize that waiting itself was teaching us something about patience, presence, and value. I grew up inside that world without questioning it. Waiting didn't feel like a skill. It felt like reality. I didn't know it could disappear, and I certainly didn't imagine a future where waiting would be seen as something to eliminate rather than accept. Technology arrived quietly at first, offering convenience without demanding attention. Small improvements, helpful shortcuts, nothing that seemed dangerous. We welcomed it, grateful for the time it promised to save, unaware of what it would slowly replace. What we didn't see was that waiting wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a space. And when that space began to disappear, something else began to vanish with it, something we wouldn't fully understand until much later. Back then, I didn't notice the shift. I was too busy enjoying how easy things were becoming. I didn't know that in removing waiting from my life, I was also removing moments I would one day miss deeply. One of the first places waiting lived was the phone. It stayed in one spot, attached to the wall, or resting on a small table, silent most of the day. You didn't carry it with you. You didn't check it. You simply lived around it, knowing that if it rang, you would hear it. And until it did, you waited without doing anything about it. Waiting for a phone call meant accepting uncertainty. You didn't know when it would come, or if it would come at all. You stayed close without hovering. You went about your day with one ear slightly open, alert to the possibility of sound. That kind of waiting required trust, not control. It asked you to be patient without reassurance. When the phone finally rang, the sound filled the whole house. It wasn't subtle. It demanded attention. Everyone heard it at once, and whoever was closest answered, often without knowing who was on the other end. There was no preview, no warning, no chance to prepare. Just connection, immediate and complete. If you missed the call, you missed it. There was no record left behind, no notification waiting to be checked later. The absence was final, and because of that, the waiting felt heavier. You learned to live with the possibility that not everything would reach you when you wanted it to. That acceptance shaped how you related to people and time. The phone taught patience without ever explaining it. You didn't sit by it all day, but you also didn't forget it existed. It lived in the background, quietly reminding you that connection required availability, not constant access. Waiting became a balance between attention and letting go. There were nights when you waited longer than expected. You wondered if the person would call. You replayed conversations in your head. You imagined what they might say. The waiting created space for thought, for feeling, for anticipation. None of that felt wasted at the time. It was simply part of caring. Technology eventually promised to remove that uncertainty, to make connection immediate, to ensure that no call would ever truly be missed. At first, that sounded like progress. Why wouldn't we want fewer unanswered questions? Fewer moments of wondering? What we didn't realize was that those unanswered moments were shaping us. They were teaching us how to sit with not knowing, how to let time pass without filling it, how to accept that some things unfold on their own schedule. When the waiting disappeared, those lessons quietly went with it. I didn't notice when that change happened. One day the phone stopped being something you waited for and became something you checked. The sound that once filled the house became optional, muted, replaceable. Waiting gave way to immediacy, and I didn't yet understand what had been lost in that exchange. Waiting also lived in the television, long before everything became available all at once. Shows didn't wait for you. They arrived at a specific time, on a specific day, and if you weren't there, you missed them. There was no replay, no pause, no guarantee that you would get another chance. That limitation shaped how we planned our evenings, and how seriously we took small promises to ourselves. We knew exactly when our favorite shows were on. The time settled into memory the same way birthdays or holidays did. You finished dinner a little faster. You hurried homework. You made sure to be in the room before the opening music started. Waiting wasn't something that happened accidentally. It was something you prepared for. Commercial breaks were part of that waiting. You didn't skip them. You lived inside them. You got a snack. You talked to whoever was nearby. You stayed close because the show would come back whether you were ready or not. Those interruptions created rhythm, a pattern of attention and release that taught us how to stay present without being constantly stimulated. Sometimes the signal wasn't perfect. The picture blurred. The sound crackled. You adjusted the antenna, moved it just enough to make things clearer. Even that small effort felt normal. You accepted that entertainment wasn't flawless, and that made it feel earned in a quiet way. You didn't expect perfection. You expected effort. Missing an episode felt significant. You asked friends what happened. You filled in the gaps through conversation rather than replay. Stories were passed along imperfectly, shaped by memory instead of accuracy. That sharing became part of the experience, connecting people through what they remembered rather than what they Waiting for television also meant accepting endings. When a show finished, it was over. You didn't immediately replace it with something similar. You sat with the absence. You talked about it. You let it fade naturally. That space between shows was another form of waiting, one that taught closure rather than distraction. Technology eventually removed that structure. Everything became available, always waiting for us instead of the other way around. At first it felt liberating. No more schedules, no more missed episodes, no more gaps. Choice expanded, and with it, the illusion that we had gained control. But something subtle disappeared along with that control. The anticipation, the shared timing, the collective pause, as millions of people watched the same moment at the same time. Waiting had created a sense of togetherness that on-demand convenience quietly dissolved. I didn't realize how much that mattered until the structure was gone. Without waiting, shows blended into each other. Moments lost their edges. The experience became endless, but somehow less memorable. And once again, waiting slipped out of my life without asking permission, taking with it another quiet lesson I wouldn't understand until much later. Waiting lived in movies too, long before screens followed us everywhere. Going to the video store was not an afterthought, it was an event. You drove there with a loose plan and a quiet hope, knowing there was always a chance your choice wouldn't be available. That uncertainty was part of the experience, not a flaw in it. You walked the aisle slowly, reading covers, turning boxes over in your hands, letting the weight of the choice settle in. You didn't scroll endlessly, you committed. The limited options forced you to decide, and that decision carried meaning because it excluded everything else. Waiting shaped the value of what you picked. Sometimes the movie you wanted was gone. The empty space on the shelf told you someone else had arrived before you. Disappointment followed, but it didn't stop the night. You chose something different. Often, those second choices became favorites, discovered not through recommendation algorithms, but through patience and chance. When you brought the tape home, the waiting continued. You rewound it if the last person hadn't. You watched previews you'd already seen. You accepted that the movie would begin when it was ready, not when you demanded it. That small delay felt normal, even comforting, like a ritual that signaled the night was truly starting. Watching a movie meant staying with it. You didn't pause constantly. You didn't jump between options. If you missed something, you missed it. Attention wasn't divided because there was nowhere else for it to go. Waiting had narrowed your focus, making the experience feel contained and complete. Returning the tape carried its own form of waiting. You checked the date. You worried about being late. You planned your day around getting it back on time. Responsibility was woven into the experience, quietly teaching respect for shared things and shared time. Technology later removed every one of these pauses. Movies became instant, infinite, interchangeable. Choice expanded until it lost weight. When something didn't immediately satisfy, it was replaced within seconds. Waiting once again was framed as a problem to solve. What disappeared wasn't inconvenience, but intention. The space where anticipation lived. The small delays that made the experience feel earned. Without waiting, movies became easier to access but harder to remember, dissolving into a stream of content without edges. I didn't notice when this shift happened. I enjoyed the convenience. I welcomed the speed. I didn't question what had been traded away. Waiting left quietly, as it always did, taking with it another way of being present that I wouldn't miss until it was already gone. Waiting also lived in letters, long before messages arrived instantly and without effort. Writing something by hand required intention. You chose your words carefully because you couldn't erase them easily. You folded the paper slowly, sealed the envelope, and let it leave your hands knowing you wouldn't be able to touch it again for a while. Once it was sent, all you could do was wait. That waiting felt different from any other. Days passed with quiet hope. You checked the mailbox not because you expected something immediately, but because the possibility existed. Most days, there was nothing, and that nothing didn't feel like failure. It felt like part of the process, like time doing what it needed to do. When a letter finally arrived, it carried weight. You recognized the handwriting before opening it. You held it for a moment longer than necessary, letting the anticipation stretch. The words inside mattered because they had traveled. They had survived time, distance, and patience. Waiting had already given them value before you even read them. Letters asked you to sit with your thoughts while you waited for a response. You replayed what you had written. You wondered how it would be received. You imagined the other person opening it, reading it slowly, deciding what to say back. That space between messages allowed feelings to deepen instead of constantly shifting. Technology eventually promised to remove that space. Messages became instant, editable, replaceable. Words could be sent and unsent, rewritten and forgotten within seconds. Communication became faster, but also lighter, less anchored. Waiting, once again, was labeled unnecessary. What disappeared wasn't communication itself, but reflection. The pause that forced you to think before speaking. The time that allowed meaning to settle. Without waiting, words lost some of their permanence, becoming easier to send and easier to forget. I didn't realize how much waiting had shaped my relationship with words until it was gone. Conversations became continuous instead of intentional. Silence between messages felt uncomfortable instead of natural. The space that once held anticipation was filled immediately. Waiting had taught care without explanation. It slowed emotion just enough to give it shape. When that slowing vanished, expression became faster, but also thinner. And like everything else waiting once held, that lesson faded quietly, leaving behind speed where patience used to live. Waiting also lived in friendships, in the simple act of finding one another without constant coordination. You didn't send messages asking where everyone was. You went outside, walked to a familiar place, and trusted that someone would be there. If they weren't, you waited. That waiting wasn't anxious. It was open, filled with the expectation that connection would happen naturally. You learned the rhythms of people without schedules. Who showed up early, who arrived late, who might disappear for a while and then return as if no time had passed. Waiting taught flexibility, the understanding that presence didn't require precision. It allowed relationships to breathe without constant confirmation. Sometimes you sat alone for a while, doing nothing in particular. You kicked the ground, watched cars pass, let time move around you. Eventually someone appeared, or they didn't. Either way, the waiting itself became part of the memory, a quiet chapter that didn't need to be filled to feel complete. Technology later reframed this kind of waiting as inefficiency. Why wait when you could check? Why wonder when you could confirm? Location became exact, availability became constant. The space where patience once lived was replaced by certainty, and with it, a subtle pressure to always be reachable. What disappeared was not connection, but trust. Trust that people would arrive without being summoned. Trust that time together didn't need constant management. Waiting had allowed friendships to unfold organically, shaped by chance rather than coordination. I didn't notice how much that mattered until it was gone. Meetings became precise but shorter. Interactions became planned but thinner. The ease of simply being somewhere and letting connection happen faded, replaced by efficiency that left little room for surprise. Waiting had taught me how to be alone without feeling lonely. It had given me comfort in unoccupied time, showing me that presence didn't always require company. When waiting disappeared, so did some of that comfort, replaced by the need to constantly fill space. I began to understand that waiting wasn't about delay, it was about allowance. It allowed people, moments, and feelings to arrive on their own terms. Without it, everything felt more controlled, but also more fragile. Friendships continued. Of course, people adapted. I adapted, but something quieter was lost in the process, something that had lived in the spaces between plans. Waiting had held those spaces gently, and when it left, those spaces closed without protest. Only later did I realize how many of my earliest memories of connection were shaped not by activity, but by waiting, by sitting still long enough for life to find me, instead of constantly moving toward it. Waiting lived in the hours after school and before dinner, a stretch of time that belonged to no one and everyone at once. You dropped your bag, changed clothes, and stepped outside without a plan. There was nothing scheduled to fill the afternoon, and that emptiness felt like freedom rather than absence. You waited to see what the day would offer. Sometimes the waiting turned into play. A bike ride that started nowhere in particular. A ball passed back and forth until it grew dark. Other times, nothing happened at all. You sat on steps, leaned against a fence, watched clouds move. That waiting didn't feel wasted. It felt like being available to whatever might come next. Dinner wasn't announced by notifications or timers. It arrived when it arrived. You listened for a voice calling your name, for the sound of a door opening, for the streetlights flickering on. Until then, you waited, trusting that the day would eventually close itself without being forced. Technology later filled those hours with constant stimulation. Screens stepped in where waiting used to live. Every quiet moment found something to occupy it, leaving little room for wandering attention. The unclaimed hours disappeared, replaced by structured time and endless options. What vanished with them was the ability to sit inside boredom without panic. Waiting had taught patience by offering nothing to do. It showed that imagination often appears only after stillness has been allowed to last long enough. Without waiting, boredom became something to escape rather than endure. I didn't realize how valuable those empty hours were until they stopped existing. Without them, days felt fuller but also more compressed. Time passed faster, not because there was more to do, but because there was less space between doing. Waiting had given shape to afternoons and edges to days. It created natural transitions, moments where life slowed before moving again. When that waiting disappeared, time lost some of its texture, flattening into a continuous stream of activity. I began to understand that waiting wasn't passive. It was a form of attention, a way of staying open to experience without directing it. Those after-school hours had taught me how to exist without needing constant input, a skill I didn't know I was learning. When waiting left those afternoons, it took with it a certain ease, the sense that time could be generous, that not every moment needed to be filled, that some of the most meaningful memories begin in moments when nothing seems to be happening at all. Waiting also lived in boredom, a word we used lightly without realizing how important it was. Boredom wasn't something to eliminate. It was something you passed through. You felt it settle in, you resisted it for a moment, and then you let it stay. Eventually, it turned into something else, without asking permission. That boredom created room for imagination. You invented games with whatever was nearby. You told the same stories again, changing small details each time. You stared at walls and windows long enough for thoughts to wander into places they wouldn't reach when distracted. Waiting gave your mind permission to roam. Technology later taught us to fear boredom. The moment it appeared, we reached for something to remove it. Screens offered instant relief, constant input, endless novelty. Waiting lost its purpose when boredom became optional. The discomfort that once led to creativity was erased before it could do its work. What disappeared was not boredom itself, but the transformation that followed it. Without waiting, Imagination had less space to stretch. Ideas arrived prepackaged, ready to consume, leaving little reason to invent anything of our own. The quiet work of the mind became unnecessary. I didn't notice this change immediately. Convenience felt generous. Choice felt empowering. Why sit with nothing when something was always available? I welcomed the distraction, unaware that it was quietly replacing a skill I had learned early without realizing it. Waiting had taught me endurance in small doses. How to stay present when nothing exciting was happening. How to let time pass without demanding it entertain me. Those lessons didn't announce themselves as valuable, so I didn't recognize them as they faded. Without waiting, moments began to feel thinner. They passed quickly, but left less behind. The days filled easily, yet memory struggled to hold on to them. I realized that some of my strongest memories came not from excitement, but from long stretches of waiting that allowed moments to sink in. Boredom had been a doorway, not an obstacle. Waiting had been the threshold. Together, they shaped attention, patience, and creativity in ways I only understood once they were gone. When technology removed them, it didn't replace what they taught. I began to see that waiting had never been empty time. It had been unclaimed time. Time that belonged to no one but the moment itself. And in losing it, we lost a quiet way of learning how to be alone with our thoughts, without needing to escape them. Waiting lived in anticipation, in the feeling that something meaningful was approaching even if you didn't know exactly what it would be. Birthdays, holidays, visits from relatives, special events, all carried a stretch of time before them that mattered just as much as the event itself. You counted days not to rush through them, but to live inside the excitement they created. That anticipation shaped emotion in a slow, steady way. You imagined what might happen. You pictured faces, conversations, small moments you hoped would unfold. Waiting gave those images time to grow, deepening the experience before it ever arrived. When the moment finally came, it felt fuller because you had already lived with it for so long. Technology later collapsed that distance. Announcements became immediate, updates constant, surprises harder to preserve. Anticipation lost its space when everything could be known, tracked, and previewed in advance. Waiting no longer had room to do its quiet work. What disappeared wasn't excitement, but depth. Without waiting, moments arrived faster but felt smaller. There was less buildup, less emotional investment, less time for meaning to take root. The present became crowded, leaving little space for longing or imagination. I didn't realize how much waiting had shaped joy until joy began to feel fleeting. Moments passed quickly, replaced almost immediately by the next thing. The satisfaction that once lingered faded faster, as if it had nowhere to settle. Waiting had been the container that held it in place. Anticipation had taught patience without effort. It made time feel generous rather than restrictive. When waiting vanished, time began to feel compressed, constantly moving forward without pause. The sense of arrival weakened because there had been no journey leading up to it. I began to notice how often I now expected immediacy, how discomfort appeared the moment something took longer than expected. Waiting once natural had become foreign, even frustrating. I had forgotten how to live inside it. Looking back, I see that anticipation was never about delay. It was about savoring possibility. Waiting allowed hope to breathe, to stretch, to become part of the experience itself. Without it, moments still happened, but they left fewer traces behind. Waiting had shaped not only how I experienced events, but how I valued them. And when anticipation quietly disappeared from everyday life, something essential about joy changed with it. Even if I couldn't name it at the time, waiting also lived in the simple act of going somewhere without knowing exactly how it would unfold. You showed up early, or sometimes late, and accepted whatever version of the moment you found. There was no live update to tell you what you were missing, or whether it was worth staying. You waited because you were already there, and being there mattered. Time spent waiting in line, sitting in cars, standing outside, or lingering in doorways, was not seen as wasted. It was absorbed into the experience itself. You talked. You watched people pass. You noticed details you would have otherwise missed. Waiting slowed your perception enough to let the world feel textured and real. Technology later reframed those moments as inefficiencies. Waiting became something to optimize away. Directions updated in real time. Schedules adjusted instantly. Delays were tracked, measured, explained. The unknown was replaced by certainty, and with it, the need to stay present disappeared. What vanished was not convenience, but attentiveness. Without waiting, there was less reason to look around, less reason to observe, less reason to let moments unfold naturally. The world became something to move through quickly, rather than something to sit inside. I didn't notice this change at first. I appreciated knowing exactly where I was going and when I would arrive. I enjoyed the sense of control. I didn't question what it was costing me, because the loss didn't announce itself as loss. Waiting had once taught me how to notice, how to be still without feeling stuck, how to let time pass without needing it to justify itself. When those lessons disappeared, I became more efficient, but also more disconnected from the small moments that used to anchor my days. I began to feel restless in pauses that once felt natural. Silence asked too much. Stillness felt uncomfortable. Waiting, which had once been a quiet companion, became something to escape as quickly as possible. Looking back, I understand that waiting had been shaping my relationship with time itself. It taught me that time was something to experience, not something to manage. When that understanding faded, life sped up, but it also became easier to forget. Waiting had given depth to ordinary movement, turning simple arrivals and departures into experiences. And when it left, the world became smoother, faster, and thinner, leaving fewer places for memory to settle and stay. Waiting lived quietly in the way days ended and began again, in the spaces where nothing demanded attention. Nights closed without scrolling, without checking one last thing. Mornings opened without updates waiting to be read. Time rested on its own edges, unobserved and unmeasured, allowing thoughts to rise and settle naturally. Sleep came differently then. You lay still, letting the day replay itself without interruption. There was no stream of new information pushing its way in. Waiting existed even there, in the simple act of letting the mind slow down until rest arrived on its own. That patience carried into the next day, shaping how you moved through it. Technology later followed us into those spaces. Nights filled with light, mornings began with noise. Waiting was replaced by immediacy, and the quiet transitions that once framed our days dissolved. Time stopped feeling like something that opened and closed, becoming instead a continuous flow without clear borders. What disappeared was not information, but reflection. Without waiting, there was less room to process what had already happened. Moments piled on top of one another without settling, making it harder to remember where one day ended and the next began. Waiting had once provided those natural pauses. I didn't notice the change right away. I enjoyed the sense of connection, the feeling of being informed and involved at all times. It felt like progress. It felt like staying current. I didn't see that constant access was quietly removing the stillness that once helped me understand myself. Waiting had taught me how to sit with my own thoughts without distraction. It had shown me that not every moment needs input to have value. When that skill faded, silence became something to fill rather than something to trust. Over time, I began to feel mentally crowded. Not overwhelmed, just constantly occupied. Thoughts had less space to stretch. Feelings moved faster, but felt shallower. Waiting, once a natural part of daily life, had been replaced by continuous engagement. I started to recognize how much those quiet edges of the day had mattered. They had been places where memory settled, where meaning formed without effort. Without them, experiences passed through me more quickly, leaving lighter impressions behind. Waiting had shaped not just how I spent time, but how time shaped me. And when it quietly disappeared from the beginning and end of my days, something essential about reflection and rest changed with it, even though I couldn't fully explain it at first. As this awareness slowly took shape, I began to notice how unfamiliar waiting had become to me. Moments that once would have passed quietly now felt restless, almost uncomfortable. Any pause seemed to demand filling. Any delay felt like something had gone wrong. Waiting, once natural, had become something I resisted without realizing it. I started to recognize this impatience in small ways. Standing in line felt longer than it should. Loading screens felt intrusive. Silence felt awkward. These moments weren't actually new, but my tolerance for them had changed. I had lost the ability to simply be where I was, without needing something else to happen. Looking back, I could see how gently waiting had trained me before. It had taught me that not everything arrives immediately, and that this delay was not a failure of life, but part of its design. When waiting disappeared, that lesson went with it. leaving behind an expectation that everything should respond on demand. I realized how much waiting had protected my attention. It gave my mind time to settle, to process, to wander. Without it, attention fractured easily, pulled in multiple directions at once. I could do more, access more, know more, but feel less anchored in any single moment. There was a time when waiting had made experiences feel heavier, more solid. Events had edges. Beginnings and endings were clear. Now moments blended together, arriving and leaving so quickly that they struggled to leave a mark. Waiting had been the pause that allowed memory to form. I didn't blame technology for this shift. It wasn't malicious. It simply offered what we wanted: speed, access, convenience, and we accepted, grateful for the ease, unaware of what we were giving up in return. Waiting wasn't taken from us. It was quietly replaced. As I reflected on this, I felt a mix of sadness and understanding. Sadness for what had faded, and understanding for why it happened. Life moved forward, as it always does. The loss wasn't in progress itself, but in forgetting that slowness had once served us well. I began to see waiting not as something obsolete, but as something missing. A human rhythm that had been smoothed away. Something that could still exist, if we allowed it, but no longer arrived on its own. It now required intention. That realization changed how I approached small delays. Instead of reaching immediately for distraction, I tried to stay with them, to feel the discomfort without escaping it, to let time pass without demanding it entertain me. It felt unfamiliar, but also grounding. Waiting had once shaped my relationship with time, quietly and consistently. Now, reclaiming it felt like learning an old language I had forgotten how to speak. Slow, imperfect, but meaningful all the same. As I began to sit more comfortably with waiting again, I noticed how different it felt depending on where I was. Some places made it easier, others resisted it. A quiet room at night invited stillness naturally, while crowded or noisy spaces made waiting feel heavier, more noticeable. Even so, I started to see how waiting followed me wherever I allowed it. There were moments when I listened to stories like this one while sitting alone, maybe at the end of a long day, or early in the morning before the world fully woke up. Other times, people listened while driving, or resting, or doing something simple with their hands. The place mattered less than the willingness to pause. I realized how personal these memories were, how differently they landed depending on where you were when you heard them. Waiting feels one way when you're home, another when you're far from it. It carries different weight depending on whether you're surrounded by noise or silence, movement or stillness. Sometimes I imagined all the quiet places where these reflections might be heard. Living rooms with dim lights, kitchens late at night, long roads stretching ahead. Small moments carved out between obligations. Each place adding its own texture to the memory being revisited. It made me understand that nostalgia doesn't live in the past alone. It lives in the present moment when we choose to slow down enough to let memory surface. Where you are when you listen becomes part of the story, shaping how it settles inside you. Waiting, once shared collectively, now happens in private pockets of time. Each person finds it in their own way, in their own space. That doesn't make it weaker, it makes it more intimate, more personal, more real. I found comfort in knowing that these memories travel quietly, meeting people wherever they are, that they don't require a specific setting, only a small opening in time, a moment of stillness where nothing else demands attention. If you're listening right now, wherever you happen to be, that place matters. It becomes part of this reflection, part of how waiting feels to you in this moment. The story adjusts itself to the space you're in, just as memory always does. Waiting has a way of connecting people without them ever meeting. Different lives, different locations, the same quiet recognition that shared understanding travels farther than speed ever could. And in realizing that, I felt something familiar return. The sense that even in a fast world, there are still moments where time slows, where attention gathers, and where waiting, gently and patiently, finds its way back to us again. As I stayed with that feeling, I began to see waiting not as something lost forever, but as something that had gone quiet, waiting for permission to return. It no longer appeared automatically in daily life, but it surfaced in moments where I chose not to rush, not to fill the space, not to demand an answer right away. Waiting had become a choice instead of a condition. I noticed how different the world felt when I allowed those pauses to exist. Sounds became clearer. Thoughts slowed down enough to be understood instead of reacted to. Time didn't stretch endlessly, but it felt fuller, more grounded, as if it had weight again. Waiting brought dimension back to moments that had been flattened by speed. There were times when it felt uncomfortable, almost unfamiliar, like sitting in a room without reaching for anything to distract me. But beneath that discomfort was something steady, a sense of being where I actually was, instead of halfway somewhere else. Waiting asked me to trust the moment rather than escape it. I thought about how much of life happens in between things, between messages, between plans, between arrivals and departures. Those in-between spaces used to belong to waiting. They held reflection, imagination, and rest. Without them, life moved faster, but understanding lagged behind. Allowing waiting back into those spaces felt like reclaiming something essential, not by rejecting technology or progress, but by remembering that not every moment needs to be optimized. Some moments simply need to be lived as they are, without acceleration. I began to see waiting as a form of respect. Respect for time, respect for other people, respect for myself. It meant accepting that not everything needs an immediate response, and that some things gain meaning precisely because they take longer to arrive. This shift didn't change the world around me, but it changed how I moved through it. Delays felt less like interruptions, and more like invitations. Silence felt less empty and more intentional. Waiting started to feel familiar again, like an old habit returning gently. I understood then that what I missed wasn't slowness itself, but the permission to slow down. Waiting had once given that permission freely. Now it was something I had to give myself, moment by moment. In choosing to do that, I felt closer to the person I used to be, not in age or circumstance, but in attention. Waiting reconnected me to a quieter version of myself that still knew how to stay. And as that awareness settled in, I realized that waiting had never truly disappeared. It had simply been buried under speed, ready to resurface whenever I was willing to make room for it again. In the end, I understand that waiting was never really about the absence of something. It was about presence, about allowing time to unfold without rushing it, without filling every space, without demanding constant answers. Waiting taught us how to live inside moments instead of passing through them too quickly. We didn't know back then that calmness was something we were practicing. We didn't recognize patience as a skill. We were simply living the only way we knew how, moving at a pace that left room for silence, anticipation, and reflection. It felt ordinary because it was familiar, not because it was insignificant. As the world sped up, that calmness faded quietly, not all at once, and not with resistance. It slipped away as convenience took its place, as immediacy became the default. Only later did we notice how much quieter life had once been, and how much that quiet had shaped us. Remembering that world now isn't about rejecting the present. It's about recognizing what was valuable before we had language for it. The slowness, the pauses, the waiting that gave meaning to what eventually arrived. Those things still matter, even if they no longer appear on their own. I find comfort in returning to these memories, not to stay in the past, but to carry something forward. A reminder that calmness is not gone forever. It simply asks to be noticed again, chosen again, protected in small ways, whenever we can. These stories exist for that reason, to pause, to remember, to sit for a moment inside a world that moved more gently, even when we didn't realize how gentle it was. A world where waiting wasn't a problem to solve, but a natural part of being human. If this reflection found you in a quiet moment, or helped you slow down even briefly, there are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories about simpler times, shared memories, and the calm we once lived inside without knowing its value. You're welcome to stay here and listen to them, to subscribe and return whenever you need a pause. Together, we can remember a world where calmness was present, where time moved differently, and where waiting quietly taught us how to be. And maybe, in remembering it, we can make a little space for it again.